Welcome to episode 5 of Left Unsaid, where we peel back the wallpaper of official history, scrape off the propaganda, and see what kind of mold is growing underneath. I'm Patrick McElwee, and I'm joined, as usual, by my son, Finn McElwee.
Hello.
And again, on Mother's Day, by my amazing wife, to the gratitude of all the listeners out there who had to suffer through last week without her, Meg McElwee.
Hi, all. It's good to be back. Nothing I'd rather be doing on Mother's Day. It's true. Nothing I'd rather be doing.
Not everybody gets to do a podcast with the two of the men that they love the most in the world.
That's true. Very grateful.
How's it been going this week?
Yeah, it just feels like there's a lot going on.
Always a lot going on. There's a lot of people in the world. Woof. Billions, I think.
Crazy.
And we just want to remind some of those billions who are listening to us right now that we could really use your help. If you happen to have an account on Spotify, or you get your podcast from Apple, or really any podcasting platform, we would love for you to leave us a review. 5 stars is always expected. And if you want to put some kind words in there, we've recently had a review from Karl Rove. Meg, you want to read out Karl Rove's review?
Where's Karl Rove's review? All right, here it is. Karl Rove, I think a jokester friend of ours, must have left this comment. But Karl Rove says, 5 stars, loving the insights and dynamics of this podcast. I'm learning a lot. Helping me get back into the news in a way that feels productive. Meg and Pat are great, and Finn is the coolest. Can't wait for more episodes. Thank you, Karl.
Thanks, Karl, buddy. I actually was in a room with Karl Rove once.
Yes, true. And who else were you in a room with, Pat?
Joseph Biden.
That's right. Did he actually touch your body?
He touched my butt.
This is family lore, and now you all know. Tell the little story.
I was a very young legislative/press outreach person at a think tank in Washington, D.C., and I was preparing for a press briefing that I was organizing with some economists, left-leaning, of course. And Joe Biden happened to be in the room that I had booked with like 3 older women, and he was just taking up that room. He loved it. He really is kind of an attention hound, or at least he used to be back when.
He didn't have dementia.
Yeah. And he was just living it up. And I had to say, Senator, because he was a senator then, he hasn't always been president. I don't know if you knew that, Finn.
No, I had no idea.
Yeah, but there was a time before he was president and he was a senator. And I said, Senator, I have the room. Is it okay if I start setting up? And he said, yeah, go ahead. And he kept going. And actually, I had a pretty good turnout. So people started coming in to the room and I'm still standing by the table, like sorting things and sweating profusely like I would do. And
just also a little bit of background here. So Patrick has a round little angelic Irish face. And back then, he was mistaken for younger than 18. Like he would go out to a rated R movie with colleagues post-college graduation, and he would get carded because people didn't think he was over 18. So you were,
I think 17 actually.
You were a baby.
That's the age for R-rated movies. Yeah, so the room had filled up, and Joe Biden, it was time for him to make his grand exit, but he couldn't really get past very easily, so he had to kind of squeeze in right behind my rear, and he kind of just scooped in right behind me and made his way out.
Yeah. Your brush with fame.
My brush with fame. What could have been?
He's made sure to wash that spot extra well, so don't worry.
One shudders to think. Yeah.
Right, well, that's not how we anticipated starting this podcast, but you never know where we're going to end up.
That's complete
once we start
improv.
Talking.
Why was I talking about that?
I don't know.
You were in a room with
Karl Rove.
I was in a room with Karl Rove. He was very charming. I gotta say, Karl Rove had like these great.
So
stories.
for those who are new to this world, like for those of you who are younger listeners, who's Karl Rove?
Karl Rove was like, he was sort of the whisperer in the ear of George W. Bush, the guy everybody thought was in power.
The little devil on his shoulder.
Except maybe Dick Cheney. Everybody thought Dick Cheney might be in power too. But Karl Rove was, he was the whisperer. He was what Steve Bannon was to the first Trump administration.
Mm. And Stephen Miller is perhaps to Trump.
Perhaps in the second administration.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe Elon Musk at times, although he seems to be kind of fading. And I would say Karl Rove was less overtly fascist than Steve Bannon. things have changed a little bit in the consigliere of the Republican Party. So thanks, Carl. We appreciate your review. And everybody else out there, I hope you're inspired to write a review of your own. You don't have to use Karl Rove's words, although you can. Just run them through ChatGPT and say, could you change these a little bit? But make them equally, if not more, flattering. Well, this is Sunday. We're recording this on Sunday afternoon on Mother's Day, and it looks like the ceasefire between India and Pakistan is holding. And so we've all got our fingers crossed.
Yes.
It's been a harrowing week between two nuclear-armed powers in South Asia, India and Pakistan. They've been trading more than just limited fire across their borders. It's been pretty extensive.
Yeah, and into each other's administrative regions of Kashmir, which is disputed territory between them.
Poor Kashmir. I mean, it sounds like such a lovely place, and it's constantly the fight of this battle between two regional powers. And I think some of the strikes have been not just in Kashmir, but within other parts of India and Pakistan. I saw, for example, that the Indian government had taken out the air defenses in Lahore, a city inside Pakistan. And that's a particularly kind of dangerous thing because if you take out the air defenses in one corridor, it means you've got a place that your planes can fly through and they can bomb deeper into the country. So it's definitely the kind of thing that, like, military observers were worried could lead to a lot of escalation. Obviously worrying since both countries have nuclear weapons.
Do you know some historical truths of this region? It's hard when you say are just opening up the New York Times and things are fairly simplistic in their telling of the situation. It seems that there were some terrorist attacks and their retaliation for terrorist attacks, but let's go a little deeper than that.
The trigger for the current back and forth between India and Pakistan was this terrorist attack against tourists, mostly tourists from India, in Kashmir. Now, we should talk about where Kashmir is and the whole thing, right? And to understand that, we have to go back a little bit in history. But just to say, Kashmir is a disputed territory between India and Pakistan. And there were militants who are opposed to the way that India is ruling the part of Kashmir it controls, ruling with a whole lot of repression, because Kashmir is a Muslim majority region. And militants who are presumed to be Muslim, I think that actually very little is known about who exactly carried out these attacks, but they had lots of guns and they killed 20-something tourists, mostly Indian or Hindu tourists, although I think also some other foreign nationals.
Yeah, and India immediately blamed Pakistan for the attacks. They said that Pakistan had facilitated the attacks, which they've provided absolutely no evidence for, and that's kind of what set off this round of conflicts.
Yeah, and I think that Pakistan has asked for there to be an international investigation, and India has said no, they won't agree to that. They don't need to, they said. They know who it is. And we should point out who India is currently ruled by, what's going on in India, right? So we've got Modi, he's a politician, and he's been bringing back a particularly virulent form of Hindu nationalism within India. India, previous to this, if you look back under Nehru, for example, who was a previous leader of India under the Cold War, India at the time sought to be a secular state, sought to be the leader of what they called the Third World, affiliated neither with the United States nor the Soviet Union. And that secularism has been under steady attack since, and now we just see India sort of ruled by this very strong nationalist Hinduism. I loved seeing that. You sent me that video of that young Indian kid. That was amazing.
Oh, that was great. Did you watch that, Finn?
I have.
I sent this reel along to Finn. I was like, hey, Finn, it's your friend. This little guy, I must have been your age, Finn, maybe a little younger even. He's being interviewed by the Indian press.
Just a rabidly nationalistic Indian press.
And he keeps on saying, like, well, I don't want anybody to die. We're all people. We're all human. And the woman's like, well, who taught you this? Who taught you this? And he's like, I have a brain, man. And he like walks off.
And they keep saying, like, do you say long live India? And he says, yes. And they say, do you say long live Pakistan? And he says, yes. And they're like, how can you say both? And he says, everybody should live in their own place.
Yeah.
I love that. Everybody should live in their own place. I mean, that I think is the wisdom of international law as it exists between nation states. That's one of the reasons that Kashmir is so dangerous, because it's a zone on the map through which there's no settled lines between India and Pakistan. And like, to really understand it, and I'm not saying that I really understand it, But I do think it's worth knowing some of the basics of where India and Pakistan even come from, right? Because they were both part of the British Raj. The British colony in India included a much larger area than what is currently India today. And after World War II, when the British just couldn't keep it up anymore, when it was clear that the empire was over, and that was true in Palestine, as we've talked about before, but at the same time, that was all going down in Palestine. Over in India, you also had the British in retreat, leaving chaos and violence in their wake. And the way that they retreated from India was to break the region down roughly according to sort of a Hindu majority area, which became India, and a Muslim majority area, which became Pakistan. And later Pakistan broke again, so you had Pakistan and Bangladesh. But we call that the partition. And there was just a massive outpouring of sectarian violence afterward that some people call a genocide on both sides. We're talking about millions of people moving to go toward the other side of the line, as well as many people who didn't make it, terrible kinds of violence. This has been studied like crazy, and there's all kinds of writing, but it seems to a lot of people that this extreme sectarianism that led to this kind of violence was itself a product of the British colonialism. And in particular, just the last sort of 20 years leading up to partition, that before then, you had hundreds of years of coexistence between these communities. In fact, so much coexistence that like a lot of times in the folk religions, you couldn't really tell the difference between a Hindu practice and a Muslim practice because they kind of would bleed into each other. You know, where you might have a Hindu shrine to the locals, you might have a Hindu shrine to a Muslim sultan or something.
Well, and even just in modern day, my good friend is, her parents are from Pakistan. She was raised here, but we took our daughters to this dance festival, which is where I was last week when you all recorded without me. But the girls had this Bollywood dance class. And my friend was like, oh, I love all this music. You know, this is the music. So this is Indian music, but they played it at her wedding. And because it's all, you know, oh yeah, we listen to each other's music. There's less separation of culture than certain parts of society there would like to believe.
As it should be. I mean, what we wish for the whole world, right?
Right.
Yeah, for example, they both do have a caste system. Obviously, India is famous for their very rigid caste system, but you know, Pakistan also has an unofficial caste system. Most of that area of the world has some sort of caste system, so these cultures are really not as far apart as many in the West believe.
And so what about the caste system? Because not being an expert in this area at all, I've sometimes thought, well, am I being ignorant to think that India has a caste system? But I'm not, right? It does. Can you say more about it?
Yeah, absolutely. The Brahmins, which are the highest caste in India, occupy the vast majority of positions of power in India. You know, they're federal judges, they're elected officials. They occupy these positions of power in much higher numbers than they should in an equal society.
Sounds slightly familiar. Like we have a sort of racial caste system, but it would be wrong, right, to think it's exactly, translatable over to how the Indian caste system works. And do you know, did colonialism create the caste system? Did they find the caste system? I'm sure it affected the caste system and maybe made it more rigid.
Yeah, absolutely. When the British came into India, a lot of the people they went to for help with advising them on how to run their colony and how to do all these things were the Brahmins, these higher caste people. So, a lot of historians think that these Brahmins used these positions of power within British-administered India to really impose rules that were beneficial to them. For example, the implementation of Hindu law really helped the Brahmin class at the expense of the lower classes. And actually, they created two law systems, one Hindu and one Muslim, which kind of forced people to separate out more rather than, mixing cultures like they had before. Now they're under two different legal systems under the British.
Huh.
Interesting. And, I feel like it feels like a recurrent theme within history when you have colonial occupations or other kinds of occupations. I'm thinking right now of the occupation of Iraq after the United States invaded in 2003, where the occupying regime ends up inflaming sectarian tensions, maybe in large part because they end up allying with certain identity groups that are maybe sort of legible to them. They can sort of understand it. Like, for example, everybody here was talking about Sunnis versus Shia in Iraq. We could understand that distinction, even if we didn't really know anything about what it meant, and didn't understand how intertwined these groups were until the occupation by the United States sort of forced them into this terrible sectarian violence.
Yeah, and I think it does have largely to do with class recognizes class, right, across cultures. I'm thinking particularly, so when we studied at Notre Dame, there were a lot of really upper class Latin American students there. And yeah, they fit right in many ways, right? Spoke English super well, but they were clearly there because they were getting an education and their intent was to go back and rule their countries. All right, like they were going to be in the administrations, they were going to be at the top, the top of the top, and be doing all these things. So
yeah, especially if they were from a smaller country, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and definitely this thing that you're talking about existed heavily in British India as well. There was kind of this cultural Darwinism that emerged that traced specifically higher caste Indians to an Aryan race that was all descended from Europe. So,
well, seriously?
Yeah, the British used this to say, oh, look, we're not like colonially occupying you. We're just like helping a brother race. We're both descended from the same people. And the Brahmins also used this to kind of shut the lower castes out. They're barbarians. They're descended from someone else. We're the true descendants of these Aryan people.
Yeah, and it makes you shudder to think about, now it's in the news that some people in the White House are floating this idea that the United States would become a kind of provisional authority in Gaza in a way that we modeled on what they did with the provisional authority in Iraq.
That worked out so well, right?
And worked so terribly that then just brought the descent into hell for many, many years in Iraq. Ended up leading to ISIS, which conquered vast swaths of Iraq and Syria for a while. It's kind of a militant terrorist group. So hopefully that gets that kind of horrific idea goes away. But there's just one horrific idea after another in Gaza.
Yeah, Israel's cabinet recently passed a resolution calling for an expansion of their war, and with that, they made comments like, "We're doing this in accordance with President Trump's plan for Gaza," which it's really horrific that this looks to be even a possibility for what the future holds.
So if you haven't yet, you really need to find the documentary The Settlers and watch that and get a sense of this.
On the BBC.
BBC, is that where it is? Okay.
Yeah, also just copied all over the internet. I watched it on X. Just some random account had posted the whole thing. So yes, so we hope not for this future occupation of Gaza. But we're talking now still about the British occupation of India and just the vast melange of resentments and identities and violence that it brought forth as soon as the British pulled back. We had the partition, we had the violence. But Kashmir was a sort of independent entity. The local ruler, a couple years after partition, decided that he actually wanted to join India, despite being a Muslim majority area, because they were getting invasions from the Pakistan side of the border, from like tribesmen in Pakistan. That resulted in a war between India and Pakistan over Kashmir. India asked the United Nations to get involved, and one of the early United Nations resolutions was that there should be elections inside Kashmir to decide whether it would join India or Pakistan. And like the UN resolutions on Palestine, that resolution, despite being an international law, has never come into play, has never been fulfilled.
Huh.
And so we have
When was that? When did that happen?
That was in the late 1940s.
Okay.
And so we have Kashmir left as this festering sore between India and Pakistan that erupts into violence periodically. And India has been trying to assert more and more control over its section of Kashmir. So we've had all this repression. We don't know what motivated the militants, but it's generating militant activity and nearly led to a nuclear exchange between these two powers. It makes me think, like, what's going to happen if Trump gets his way and we throw away the United Nations. We throw away all of the international law that was created after World War II to make sure that kind of thing didn't happen again, especially now that the world saw the use of nuclear weapons for the first time. What's going to happen if that's all thrown away and we go back to this sort of nations as spheres of influence, where the United States has its sphere of influence and Russia has its, and it's just kind of might makes right? If there's nuclear weapons now, because
I'll tell you what, new. I think that Trump's plan is pretty simple. I think he wants to get the Nobel Peace Prize.
What? Please say more.
Him and Henry Kissinger.
How so?
Did you hear that Daniela Weiss, the woman in the settlers,
Daniela Weiss, the sort of godmother of the Israeli settlers in the West Bank.
She's been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize.
By who?
I don't know.
Can anybody be nominated?
I don't know.
Like, who could nominate? Could I just write a letter and nominate somebody?
I don't know. Anyway, Trump actually, I read it today. Yes, he wants the world to see him as the peace president, which is interesting.
Was he thinking about Ukraine in this case?
He's thinking about that. He's trying to claim that he was the one who instigated the ceasefire between India and Pakistan. He's kind of shunning Netanyahu a little bit in his upcoming trip to the Middle East. I think perhaps he wants the war to be over. I don't know what his deal is, but yes, someone in his cabinet was quoted as saying, "Well, if he doesn't get it, then what is it even for?" So
he get what?
The Nobel Peace Prize.
Mm-hmm.
So this sort of again, a megalomaniac, he goes around and he makes his own little personal deals. It's the art of the deal guy.
He needs validation.
He really does.
If only his father had loved him, imagine.
Huh.
Yeah, what are we to make of this this news that maybe there's some rift between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel? I mean, some people have suggested that's a smokescreen. That's just like the initial ceasefire that went into place right after Trump came into office, where it seemed like maybe the Trump administration was going to bring some pressure to bear on Israel. But now, obviously, we are how many days? We're like 65 plus days into a complete blockade of all international aid, all food going in to Gaza, which is just a horrific development. And now they're saying they're going to be doing a ground invasion of Gaza. This is worse than the blockades that we were talking about under the Biden administration. I'm not sure the Biden administration would have been able to or been willing to tolerate a complete blockade like this, but the Trump administration has. So some people were saying that this idea that there's daylight between Trump and Netanyahu is just sort of public relations. Yeah,
I, for one, am highly skeptical of any actual rift between Trump and Netanyahu. It may have something to do with Trump's ego. It's probably a combination of multiple factors, but at the end of the day, the arms shipments are still going out. And
he's saying nothing about there's not a mention of Israel that needs to lighten up here, let some food through.
Yeah.
Even Biden said that, while still sending the arms. But
they had the whole thing where they built the little bridge that didn't work.
Right.
Was supposed to, they were airdropping aid for a while.
Yeah.
So I do think that there was some pressure under the Biden administration. I don't want to I'm not going to say which side I come down on in this ongoing debate about who's worse for the Palestinians, Biden or Trump. I mean, they're both freaking so awful. It's how can you pick? But I think in this regard, the Biden administration was better.
Yeah, but definitely not good. I mean, The Intercept recently reported that there was no pressure from the Biden administration behind doors at all for a ceasefire.
The Intercept is a good place to look for news if you're kind of new to this left world. The Intercept, I'd also say if you're looking, if you don't want a subscription to, say, some of these places do require subscriptions, but Democracy Now! You can always find daily news episodes on YouTube for free. It's a great place to go if you don't want to be in the liberal news bubble of the New York Times.
And all the other newspapers that are just derivatives of the New York Times.
Right.
All right, well, I don't want to pretend like everything bad is happening far away from here. We've also seen some pretty disturbing scenes locally here in the United States.
Very disturbing. I could hardly sleep after I watched that video out of Massachusetts.
Worcester.
Why is it said Worcester, but it's spelled Worcester?
Just easier.
English.
It's one less syllable. Worcester. I don't know. No one's ever explained that to me. But yeah, we saw this video of an abduction of a mother.
A 16-year-old.
Well, the 16-year-old was arrested trying to defend her mother, right? Mm-hmm. And her face was also slammed to the ground.
So what was really striking to me about this footage, ICE going after this woman and her baby, she had a baby too. So they're violently going after this family from Brazil, I believe. Mm-hmm. What almost also brought me to tears were all the people in that neighborhood who came out and were like screaming at the police officers who were trying to put their bodies between ICE and this family, who once the ICE got them into the car, you hear people calling the local 911, calling the local police, which is not supposed to collaborate with ICE to come and help. And you see just regular everyday citizens like putting themselves on the front of the ICE car and their fingers having to be pried away by these, and I've seen several videos like this where people will create a wall, a human wall, to prevent ICE from coming and taking people away, or at least try. Made me think of Denmark after the Nazis took over Denmark. And after they announced the pogrom, that everyday Danish citizens mobilized. They didn't have these networks already in place. They just mobilized and saved 90% of the Jewish population. And it makes you think, like, is it time for us to, as U.S. citizens, is it, like, should we be hiding people? Like, what is...
Yeah, providing sanctuary.
Right.
I mean, we've had the sanctuary movement sort of sprung up, and it's there. People have been doing the sanctuary movement for quite a while now, but maybe it's time to scale that up. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Yeah, and you also have these dystopian messages and threats really coming from the Trump White House. Stephen Miller, for example, who's Trump's border czar, when asked a question if he plans to suspend habeas corpus, which is the right of people to have a trial for something they're charged with. It's
the right that means you can't just be thrown into prison. You can't just be thrown in a dungeon and just left there.
Yeah, it's a fundamental tenet of American democracy. And he answers this question with, quote, "That's an option we're actively looking at," unquote.
So the option being suspending habeas corpus.
Yes. And he also says a lot of it depends on whether the courts do the right thing or not, which is a clear intimidation of the courts. If the courts do the right thing, great. If they rule in a way we don't like, snap fascism.
And they're just, the fact that they're deporting people to this prison in El Salvador, CECOT, right? CECOT. I mean, it looks like something out of a futuristic right-wing dystopia, and just run by this guy Bukele, the leader of El Salvador, who just styles himself as like a no-law avenger, no-law enforcer against any kind of gang violence, suitably broadly interpreted.
Yeah, and also an investigation found that 70 to 90% of the people that have been sent to this dystopian prison have no criminal record whatsoever.
Sick. So when did immigration becomes so central to the Republican Party's politics? I mean, it's clearly tied to the rise of MAGA.
Well, it goes way, way back.
It goes way back. But, I was in D.C. in 2003, back when I met Joe Biden. And in that time, George W. Bush was president. And as I might have pointed out before in this podcast, I really don't like George W. Bush in a lot of ways. But
this is an understatement.
On immigration, George W. Bush was in favor of something that everybody called comprehensive immigration reform. And one of my first tasks, again, as this little 15-year-old looking guy, was to go to the office of Senator Ted Kennedy, and I would sit there while labor unions on the one side and the Chamber of Commerce and other business groups on the other side would just negotiate about immigration reform in front of the Senate staff and us immigrant advocates. I worked for the Catholic bishops. And Catholic bishops are pretty good in promoting the dignity of immigrants in this country. And so they would sit there, and the idea was that if you could bring labor plus business plus the government to bear and have a compromise, that you could solve some of these immigration problems. Well, it turns out, no, there was a huge backlash, and it became core to the rise of what we all call MAGA now.
Because there were a few loonies in the government at that time. They were extreme, and now they're in charge.
Yeah, I mean, there was like a handful of representatives in the House of Representatives who would get themselves named to be like the chair of some subcommittee. And yeah, they would pursue these they would bring in these lunatics.
I mean, that just so racist. Like, I'd say back then, Republicans, general Democrats, still racist, but at least didn't say it overtly. But these folks did.
Yeah, the idea that these people are illegal first rather than human first was a huge part of what they like to say. They only call them illegals, and the words undocumented or human, they don't come up.
Yeah, I saw one clip, in fact, where I think it was Stephen Miller again was talking about someone they had deported, and he starts to say, this father did this, but then he corrects himself, and I'm sorry, illegal alien. It's clearly a dehumanizing term, and if you look to history, you have to be very critical of these dehumanizing terms because they can be used and have been used to justify a lot.
I mean, in 1986, Ronald Reagan was the president who signed an amnesty that legalized the status of 3 million people who were in the United States without documents. And when he left office in 1989, he was still citing it as one of his greatest achievements.
Yeah. But, this goes back to the early 1900s, right? And really the basis, the founding principle of our current immigration law is eugenics. And I don't think most people think about that when they think about immigration law, but it's very much true.
Eugenics being the purported science of racial superiority, right?
Yeah. And I'm reading this book, Bad Law by Elie Mystal, and there were in the early 1900s racial quotas who they would let into the U.S.
In the early when?
Early 1900s.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first immigration laws were the Chinese Exclusion Act, for example, in the late 1800s.
Yeah.
That was aimed solely at the Chinese because, man, were we angry they helped us build the railroads, right?
Right. And you had quotas on Italians and whoever else, Irish and whatnot to come in. But the one group back in the 20s that didn't have this quota were the Mexicans and Latin Americans.
Like the Americas were considered sort of an open zone.
And the reason why it wasn't because they weren't racist. It's because there, even back then, and there continues to be now, a business lobby, because people want to be able to bring people in and exploit them for cheap labor and then send them back. So the way they got around this was by passing the Undesirable Aliens Act of 1929. And what that did was it made illegal reentry a crime. So it particularly affected guest workers, right? Workers who are coming in, seasonal workers, agricultural workers, and all sorts of folks who say don't have the money, the time, the patience, really the money to deal with these, all of the bureaucracy of becoming a legal citizen, right? And they will say a guest worker now will be able to will come 1 year and all of a sudden find out that something has changed in their status and they didn't know, and so now they're a criminal and they're kicked out. So at any rate,
that's contested. I mean, the application of the word criminal to someone who overstays a visa is one of these new flourishes from MAGA because immigration is not criminal law. It's something called civil law. And so somebody who has an immigration violation, who's overstayed their visa or something like that,
right, they
don't actually have a criminal, that's not a criminal offense. That's a civil offense. And so to label them criminals is just inaccurate. But yeah, and one thing that strikes me about this 1929 law is we're talking about a time when borders were just beginning to crystallize in that kind of way. I mean,
let's not forget that the U.S. took over a bunch of Mexico's land. So what was interesting to me in thinking about this time period is this is when my great-grandparents moved to the Central Valley in California from Mexico.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. Just right around the same time. I mean, I don't know the specific dates, but that would have worked out timing-wise, late 20s, early 30s maybe. So this law that goes into place to try to restrict Mexican immigrants.
And also, like, they're in this law, they're saying that you have to cross at official ports of entry
Yeah.
for the first time. Because, before that, you would just walk, you just go, you wouldn't
There's a
know
road,
when
right?
you crossed the border because the border wasn't a real thing. And now they're saying you have to cross to official points of entry. And, it reminds me, there's just a little bit after this, you have this great Mexican comic, Cantinflas. He's kind of in the early days of Mexican cinema, and he has this great scene. If you ever look it up, Cantinflas, put a link to it somewhere. And there's a Mexican guy coming up with his donkey, and it's in the middle, like the desert. And he comes across this gate in the middle of the desert. And he kind of knocks on it. There's nobody around. It's kind of locked. So he kind of walks around it, and then there's this gringo, "Hey, stop there, hombre," kind of Texas guy who they go through a funny skit about, sort of having to walk through the gate rather than around it because, these official ports of entry were fictions.
Yeah, so Cantinflas is funny. But then you think about like the racism that was behind the 1929 law. It was actually the guy, his name was Dr. Harry Laughlin. He is probably one of the most evil men in American history. And he was this high school science teacher who became interested in genetics. And he eventually became one of these experts in, quote, like eugenics, right? And his theories on like race and genetics were adopted by guess who?
Mr. Rogers.
No. Adolf Hitler. He was given an award by the University of Heidelberg in 1936. So this guy, Dr. Harry Laughlin, was testifying in Congress. There were some overt racists there who brought him in and provided the backbone of the rationality behind this immigration law to keep the Mexicans from staying here. They wanted them to be able to come, as my sense, to work for really bad wages and to be able to kick them back. And my guess is they also didn't want the same people coming all the time because you could guess that if you're a more senior seasonal worker, you might have more knowledge of the system. You could probably organize. I'm guessing that, I don't know. This is my speculation. But they wanted the new Mexican blood to be able to come in, do the agricultural jobs that needed done, kick them back out. They did not want them staying. And
they didn't want them to sully the gene pool, is that what you're saying?
Exactly. And so as someone who has
sullied, okay, yeah.
I am the sullied gene pool. So I'm going to read.
Sorry, Finn.
Finn, you are too. You are exactly what Harry Laughlin did not want to have happen. This mongrel Mexican, and I guess I don't know. Irish became white. When did the Irish become?
Oh, we
quote,
sold out
white?
A long time ago.
So here's a quote from him. Whenever two races come in contact, there is always race mixture in the long run, and the upper levels tend to maintain themselves because of the purity of the women in the upper classes. The women of the upper classes marry only into their own racial and social levels. The women of the lower classes and so-called inferior races tend to take mates, whether legitimately or illegitimately, from dominant or upper races. The only thing that has prevented the complete mixture of races where the two come in contact is the high virtue and the high mate selection standard of the women of the dominant classes. The time will come when the several states, rather than the federal government, in making marriage laws and the people in the building up their customs, will have to demand fit mating and high fertility from the classes who are better endowed physically, mentally, and morally by heredity, and to prevent, either by segregation or sterilization or otherwise, the reproduction by the more degenerate classes. Immigration control is the greatest instrument which the federal government can use in promoting race conservation of the nation.
High fertility among the upper classes. Where have I heard that lately? I'm trying to think.
Yes, this is also news of the week.
Was that Elon Musk? I mean, doesn't he have like 13 kids?
I think more now.
Yeah. So, these are old ideas and they have a storied pedigree. I mean, yeah, it's worth knowing that this is like where the immigration quotas came from. They were these racial quotas, right, in the 20s. Now, my understanding of it is in the 60s, right, during the Cold War, this race theory went way, way out of vogue. We had the civil rights movement successfully here in this country. And in the context of the Cold War, with all the countries around the world watching what the United States is doing and the Soviet Union using the racial supremacy in the United States as a propaganda point against the United States, it went way out of vogue. And so in the 60s, they dressed it up. They changed it from being explicitly racial to being of national origin. But in neither case were they like studying the needs of the country or of people in general, of migrants, of the world. There was no study of the facts on the ground and then a scientific, rational assignment of numbers to various racial or national groups. No, they made it up, and it was completely unrealistic. And that's why by 1986, there were 3 million people in the country who had no legal status. That's a problem of the law, far from being a problem of people's actual actions. If the law has no relationship to what people actually do, well, that's what's going to happen. And what basically it does is it just creates this underclass of millions of people in this country who can't do normal things like feel protected by the police or have some protection against their employers if they choose to organize. So it creates people with like less rights than everybody else living here.
Speaking of, ICE just recently arrested some union organizers that were farm workers. And apparently this was kind of a coordinated thing. They had a list of these union leaders and they went after them.
Surprise, surprise.
So we're getting the 1920s, just like you're describing, come roaring back in the form of MAGA. And like, what are the other things that they say? They love to say crime is associated with immigration.
Yes. They love that. And I find that to be such a poor argument because all you have to do is look anywhere on the internet for the crime statistics starting from 1993 to 2023, and you'll see that they've fallen precipitously. Like there's the conflation of immigration with crime rates is just it's patently false.
Just made up.
Completely made up. Like here, so the crime rate has fallen. It shows a 59% reduction in crime, 75% reduction in burglary.
That's since when?
1993.
So 1993 to today, 59% reduction in crime. So that means like of every 10 crimes that were committed in 1993, only 4 are being committed today. Is that what that means?
Yeah. But interestingly, people's perceptions are that crime is rising. So at least 60% of U.S. adults have said there is more crime nationally than there was the year before, despite this downward rate in crime rates during most of that period. I mean, you'll see little upticks and little downticks, just slight variations, right? But the people will say in every Gallup crime survey since the 1990s, Americans have been much less likely to say crime is up in their area than to say the same about crime nationally. So they're not basing it necessarily off of their own personal experience of crime, but they're watching the news, perhaps. They're getting information somewhere, or perhaps it's simple racism that they assume that crime is worse elsewhere.
Maybe they just see scary people,
Well, also the argument that, immigrants commit a large portion of the crimes that are committed is wrong. Per capita, they commit less crimes than U.S. citizens do. If we're concerned about cracking down on crime, we should go around arresting U.S. citizens. You'll have a higher likelihood of arresting a criminal than you would if you go around arresting migrants.
So don't believe what you read in the newspaper, folks.
Yeah.
You heard it here first. Crime is not a rising issue, and immigrants are not to blame.
Now, that is not to say that homelessness is not a rising issue.
There's many issues that are rising.
Right. So
crimes by the rich.
Crimes by the rich.
I also want to say
rising.
that locally, I wouldn't say that thought crimes are not on the rise because I'm seeing them happen left and right here in front of me. And I appreciate both of my fellow criminals, Meg and Finn. I think it's about time for us to wrap this up. Anybody have any concluding thoughts?
Free Palestine.
That's been episode 5 of The Left Unsaid. Please help us spread our foul propaganda. Tell your friends, tell your enemies, leave us a rating, leave us a review, and we will catch you next week in episode 6.